Welcome back, everybody. We are getting excited for our next panel with Lynne Barrett, MJ Fievre, and Joe Clifford. They're going to be talking about anthologies. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Welcome.
How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. We've been having a terrific time so far. And I just want to mention before we get started that we are promoting different charities that are helping people out on Sanibel Island. And the one I want to mention right now is Eagles in Need, which is the one through FGCU. It is targeted at helping people at FGCU, students, staff, and administration, faculty who have been most impacted by Hurricane Ian. So if you are able to and you feel motivated, please go to the link. I believe it should be down there somewhere. There it is. And donate if you are able. We really appreciate that. And the people who were affected by the storm really appreciate it. And I also appreciate that you guys all decided to join us online, even though we couldn't be on the island. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists here. Lynne Barrett and MJ have both been here in the past, and so welcome back. Joe Clifford, this is the first time you're here, and I'm really excited that you're coming to the party this year. So Lynne Barrett's short story collection Magpies received the Florida Book Award, the gold medal. Her fiction and essays can be found in all kinds of different publications. She has received the Edgar Award for Best Mystery Story. She teaches creative writing at Florida International University, and she edited the anthology Making Good Time, True Stories of How We Do and Don't Get Around in South Florida. Joe Clifford is the author of the best-selling award-nominated J. Porter series, as well as the acclaimed addiction memoir Junkie Love, which my students are reading this semester, and the novels The Lake House and The Shadow People, as well as the editor of a whole bunch of anthologies, including Trouble in the Heartland, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Bruce Springsteen, which I'm kind of angry you didn't ask me to contribute to. And the forthcoming No Body, No Crime, noir fiction inspired by the songs of Taylor Swift. His work has been nominated for numerous Anthony Awards and ITW's Novel of the Year. MJ Fievre spends much of her time building up her students, helping them feel comfortable in their skin and affirming their identities. Her close relationships with parents and students led her to look more closely at how we balance protecting a child's innocence and preparing them for the realities of adult life. She wrote Raising Confident Black Kids and the widely acclaimed best-selling book series for young adults, Badass Black Girl. And she speaks all over the place and helps people to tell their stories far and wide. So you guys just take it away from here. MJ, do you want to lead it off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm so excited to see you, Lynne and Joe, and I personally know your work and I love it. But for those of us who don't know you, would you tell us a little bit about your relationship with anthologies? Do you love them, hate them? Have you been in them? Have you curated them? Tell us everything, Lynne.
I've done a bit of all of those things. I have edited and co-edited anthologies. I've had work in anthologies. I would say that I also previously, when I was in grad school, I edited a literary magazine. I was a fiction editor. And then I also edited other magazines later, literary magazines. And that's a kind of stepping stone to anthologies. If you look at a literary magazine, it's a collection of work, but it's not put together with a concept. You know, there might be a theme sometimes for an issue, so that's moving towards anthology. But then if you get further along, then you're thinking in terms of, it might be subject matter, it might be genre, it might be focusing on a particular kind of life experience with a nonfiction anthology, it might be place. So I've been in them, and I've edited them and co-edited them. As it happens, I'm going to wave this one which is Making Good Time, which was mentioned. I'm afraid the glare won't get you this really fantastic cover, because this is an anthology. I came up with the idea of having people write about South Florida, but in the sense of movement, because of the amount of development and craziness, and in the nature of it is a place people visit and ruin with traffic and all those other things, and the kinds of getting around. And so the press that did this is a local press, which also is an arts organization that runs a lot of events. And the contributors I invited. So just to say, I had to write a book proposal, so we could talk about that more later, what goes into a book proposal, and then met with the editors, and the publishers, and they then went for the idea that it would all be different forms of creative nonfiction rather than an array of genres, and that it was formed around movement. So you could say that how we don't get around is traffic, but it's really all kinds of movement, whether you're walking or anything else. And it came out in September of 2019, and there were loads of events. And then in early March of 2020, we all stopped getting around at all, which was sort of an abrupt new riff on the subject. But it contains work by both MJ and Joe, and actually they're in the same section of the book, which was interesting to me. They're sort of adjacent, and that section is called Running into Trouble. So, and they're MJ's piece is called So Damn American, and Joe's is called Acetabulum, and they're entirely different. So one of the things you want with an anthology is not a lot of repetition, right? You want very different angles and takes, and this one does have that. And that's because I got to invite a big array of very gifted people.
Thank you so much, Lynne. It was great part of this project. And I'm curious about you, Joe. Tell us a little bit about your work with anthologies.
Well, like Lynne said, I think it starts with literary magazines. When I returned to school after my failed experiment as a homeless man in the 90s, I signed on to handle literary magazines, both undergrad and for my graduate program. I bypassed the more lucrative, professionally, probably prudent path of student teaching to be on literary magazines and edit them. I love the diversity of voices, the different kind of stories, and how it all comes together. I come from a musical background. You can probably see my guitar there. And to me, they feel almost like a record in a way that, you're setting tracks down and you kick it off with a real bang, and you want to dial it back a little bit. So you're doing that with anthologies as well. The anthologies I've edited have also, interestingly enough, been around music. The big one being the Springsteen Trouble in the Heartland. But yeah, I treat it kind of like, when I'm putting it together, almost like I'm in the studio now making a record, and I really do treat it like track listings, because you want that balance of, you can't have too much hot in the beginning. You got to pull it back. You got to have your ballads. You got to have. So that's how I look at it. More taking a step back. But I've also done one on Johnny Cash. I've been in a number of anthologies. The strange thing is probably the best professional success I had came from being asked by Richard Brewer and Gary Phillips to be in a collaborative novel anthology of connected stories called Culprits, which was picked up by Disney Plus. So it's really strange how this industry works, but an anthology gives you just as good a chance to break through as a novel. And if you get a chance to work on one or be in one, really, it's an honor to take it seriously, because great things can come from it.
We're mostly going to talk today about the creation of the anthology, but although you covered some of that, Joe, I'm curious about why someone would choose to submit to an anthology. What are the incentives?
Well, besides the possibility of getting picked up by Disney Plus, no, there's a lot of as a profession, writing, you got to come at it from all different angles. I've always believed it's all part of the same delightful coin, right? Editing, writing, anthology, short stories, even poetry. So for me, it's just a different challenge. It's a different arena. It's a different avenue of the same field I'm always working in. But it's divergent enough that I get to do things that maybe I don't get to do in novels, or something I maybe don't get to do in short stories.
if I can pick up on that for a minute, there's a question about the difference between a collection of short stories, which would be an authored collection by one author. An anthology has a whole bunch of different authors. And the benefit of that is that because of interest in the general topic, that is the focus of it. So this is Trouble in the Heartland that Joe edited, which is a songs, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Bruce Springsteen. So if you're interested in Bruce Springsteen, you might read it, and you might never have heard of, say me, but you read something else and then you read. So it's a way that your work gets seen in a certain context, where it's sort of been curated to be together, which is more targeted to an audience than a literary magazine might be, although they can certainly try that, and I've edited them. And a story can be seen and more can happen with it. So I would also mention there's other kinds of anthologies like prize anthologies, where at the end of a year, the best American short stories or the best American mystery and suspense. I did write one short story very early on in my career that won an Edgar Award, and I looked, and it appeared in many anthologies, not just prize anthologies, but ones in other languages. And it also appeared in ones that were focused on content in it. So ones that had music as a focus because my story had music in it and so on. So part of it is that when you write short work, particularly, you want it to be seen, and it's good if there can be multiple ways that people will discover new voices and work and follow a trail of something they're interested in and be really surprised because they bought the book for one thing and they love something else that's in it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. Now let's talk about what it takes, right? First, why does someone decide, okay, I'm going to put together an anthology? So what's usually the goal, and how do you come up with a concept?
Joe's edited more of them than I have, where he initiated it. So maybe you could talk about what makes you decide to do that.
Sure. Anytime I speak with Lynne, I feel so underprepared because she is, the way she approaches writing and life is a much more organized, formatted, linear pattern. I look at life and writing and anthologies, and just about everything I do is sort of, let's see what happens. And with the Springsteen anthology, we were on Facebook, and somebody had submitted a story called Candy's Room to one of the small places that were doing the online publishing. It was a great little thing. I'm like, hey, we should, it's a thread starts. I'm like, we should do a Springsteen anthology. And by the end of the day, we had 90% of the authors. I had a letter, email out to Dennis Lehane, and I had a publisher lined up. And so that's I didn't start the day planning an anthology. By the end of the day, I had a project in one of the bigger books I've been involved with, and certainly one of the bigger authors with Dennis. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer of kind of laying out there. There have been projects like the Taylor Swift one that's not going to happen right now, but that I've had long-term plans for. I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan, so for a long time I wanted to put that together, and I'm hoping that's still going to happen at some point down the road. But yeah, it's sort of how I'm feeling. It's sort of what I'm thinking. I could be listening to the iTunes come on shuffle, and all of a sudden I hear Johnny Cash. I'm like, that'd be another great one. So yeah, that's just how I approach life. I don't have quite the organizational skills. I'm a little more scatterbrained. I hope that answers your question, because I kind of forgot what the original one was.
I would say that it can a lot of things can originate in a lot of ways, and he exaggerates my deliberation by far. A friend of mine and I each had a child, the first child in each case, at a certain point in time, and we kept trying to find things to read. So this was in the 90s, trying to find things to read that were about the experience that weren't, just instructions from others, because the experience is very disorienting and strange, and like, what are we doing here, and so on. And so we started finding individual pieces, and she was in Pittsburgh, I was in Miami, and we would sort of trade those. And after, also we're exhausted with children and everything else, so it took a while, about 3 years before we said, there should be an anthology. There's not that much. And also everything is very gendered, so that there's all these books about being a mom, but there's nothing about being a father of a baby, for instance, and adoption, which was something else to look at. And so we then spent a bunch of time trying back and forth to figure out how to do it. She had much more experience of having worked at a press than I did. I had experience of editing magazines. And we made a book called Birth, a Literary Companion, which was published by Iowa, which has writing by men, women, gay men, couples adopting babies and everything. And it took quite a bit of time. And there was a lot of doubt about it. And then it was very, very successful. It's still in print from the University of Iowa Press. But because we were trying to do something that wasn't as easily clear as a Springsteen collection would be, and because we were sort of fighting a lot of expectations. So, but fascinatingly, also, we needed to pay people, but there was a budget from the press, and we had to do a lot of negotiating because these works had been, if they'd been published before, you're having to pay for rights. And that's a whole other very complex thing, but because Kristen Kovacic, co-editor, had worked at a press, she knew much more about that. But we actually had people who wanted more money for a poem, it's a mix of genres, than the whole budget we had, in which case we just said no. So that's a whole business side that really has not been the situation for other anthologies that I've dealt with.
So what about we make a laundry list? You talked about in finding a publisher. What happens before you even approach a publisher? What are some of the things we do?
I think you have to get a concept that's clear in your mind, because and that, you know, you may be operating solo, you may be operating with someone else. You can have organizations that decide to do an anthology that's going to represent the organization. That's a whole other ball of wax to get into. So you're having to kind of get clear on what you're doing. You have to figure out how you're going to get contributions, because you can do an open call. You could solicit. So Joe described basically getting in touch with people whose writing he knew he liked and would work well for the topic for the Bruce Springsteen one. And that's not a public call for submissions. But in cases like the birth, actually I'll do Making Good Time, I did have people I knew I would ask who were writers who would have, you know, very different takes. But I also asked people to recommend others, because there were people who'd been writing about issues with stories with transit and issues of movement and stuff like that in South Florida, who's I didn't know. And so I got some of the best recommendations secondhand, but I did not put out a public call. The same press has put out another book since Waterproof, where they did have a public call, and it's a much longer editing process because you're getting so many submissions.
Yeah, you know, if I can touch on that public call versus soliciting for a second, that's a tough one for me. I guess, you know, if I'm looking at a kind of a hierarchy, I'm looking at literary magazines, maybe reading series like Lip Service that I was a part of with Andrea Askowitz, who also wrote a wonderful birth book you should check out. You know, that's where I believe the open submissions works a little bit better. For me, maybe it might come from just the fact that I take the rejection so hard as a writer when I'm on the other side that I can't stand saying no. Or it could just be that when you get to the anthologies, you sort of, you know, once the idea comes into shape and begins to take form, you start to think of who can do what, because the community, you become so immersed in the community, you know who has the skill set. I know Jen Connolly is going to write a fabulous story. I should have asked if we're allowed to swear, so I'm not going to. But she's a fantastic writer. And so I know that anytime I'm doing an anthology, I'm reaching out to Jen Connolly. She's one of the best short story writers I know. So things like that make the job a little easier, because there's so much, I'm built to swear away. No, it makes the job easier because there's so many other facets that you're going to be involved with in an anthology. I think going through a slush pile, it just makes it harder. Conversely, it's also not fair to authors who are trying to break into anthologies, which I'm very aware of, and it's something I've grappled with. But that's how I've treated it, just to keep my sanity, because, you know, putting together an anthology, you know, getting the authors is kind of the easiest part. After that, then it's the editing and the publishing and the promotion and all that stuff. So that's how I've gone about it. But everyone has going to have a different idea. You know, every editor is going to have a different philosophy for how they want to handle it.
MJ, could you talk about this a little bit yourself, because you've been on both sides of that, and for instance, you were running a journal at one point and spinning projects off from that. So, you know, talk a bit about what that was like.
Absolutely. I mean, as a writer and as an editor, you have to have thick skin. you will get rejected. And it doesn't matter if you're a new writer or an established writer. Sometimes you write a piece that nobody likes but you. So it's particularly sensitive for the writer and the editor when it's been a requested piece. If Joe asked me to write a piece and he hates it, it takes courage for him to say, MJ, we're not publishing this. And I have to understand that it's not personal, that Joe doesn't like the piece, that it's not appropriate for this particular anthology. Um, I've been included in the anthologies where I've been contacted personally to submit, and it's always a big honor. Someone knows your craft and is celebrating it. I've responded to calls for submissions, and sometimes again you get accepted and you get rejected. I always make sure that it's an editor I want to actually work with, and we can talk about that later when we get to the publishing stage. I always check what the goal of the anthology is, whether it's maybe charity or to to answer a question that hasn't been addressed in the market. Maybe I'm really wary of vanity anthologies where the only goal is for the person producing the anthology to be able to add it to their resume, and there's really no benefit to the writers or anyone else. So yeah, it was a pleasure to be in Making Good Time. Thank you again, Lynn. One anthology that was very special to me was So Spoke the Earth. This is an anthology that the women writers of Asian descent released after the earthquake in Haiti in 2012, just because we felt at risk of losing everything.
Right.
One moment you have something you love, one moment it's gone. So we wanted to honor the country and at the same time give a voice to many people who usually don't have a voice. And a lot of the money did go to charity, so there was a specific goal. So that's been my experience. And I really want to talk a little bit about the publishing side. I'm curious about how you go about approaching a publisher. Lynn, you mentioned a book proposal, and I know that those two words are very scary to many people. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So a book proposals are done in nonfiction in general, but an anthology, now you wouldn't have to do it if you already have a relationship with the press and they're going to be open to it and stuff. But in general, it helps you get organized, because a book proposal, you have to say what the concept is. You have to say what the vision is for what the contents will be, what makes it make sense. You have to be able to say something about who the audience will be, and how you're going to reach that audience, so in my case, they have not been coming from a press that I was running, which is a whole other side of it. So you have to have a good relationship with the press, and be clear on what the expectations are and things like that. And they vary really a lot. And sometimes it's the hands of the editor. So this is grabbed poets and writers on sexual assault, empowerment, and healing, there was a session last year, which anybody can watch because it's archived, from that. And this is a book that came up from a concept in the moment of the grabbed incident, but it took years to get it to, build it up. And also in building it up and amassing who would be the contributors, it moved up in their aim of publishers so that it's published by Beacon Press, quite a major press to do it. And it also has a whole accompanying website where more writing is getting done and talking about how to use it in teaching and stuff. So you could start, but that started with like 3 people having a conversation at a conference for 12 seconds, and then it takes years to reach the fruition, and it just really varies a whole lot if you have already a connection with a press or not. I have edited ones where I was invited to edit something. I don't have this here, but Tiger Tail, which was an arts events organization in South Florida, had a series every year that was a poetry book that had a very specific small format with very short work because it was poetry. And they asked me to do one because people knew I could edit, and they wanted me to do it with noir poems. And I said, noir poems are going to sound too alike, like a whole collection of, let's say, 55 noir poems. I don't, and I persuaded them to let me turn it to being non-poem forms, which could be fiction, it could be memoir, it didn't matter, but it couldn't have line breaks. That was my one rule, so it wasn't poetry. And I had to figure out the length that would fit. And so I was looking, because the template already existed, I was counting the number of words on the page in this book, which would be a very small book. And it turned out that the limit was somewhere 300 to 310 words, the ones I was counting. And I had the brain flash that I would make the word limit 305 words, which is the original area code for all of Florida and is the area code in Miami. And it got, just because of having this one weird hook, it got a lot of publicity that it came from that it matched place in some way. The shortest piece is by Joe that's in there. And it's 29 words or something. So I've taught with the book and had, I'm teaching people like, here, this, and they're like, you know what, it is a story in 29 words. So that's a very interesting kind of experience where the publisher came to me, which meant I had to say yes or no as to whether I could do something that fits their mode. So I didn't have to have a book proposal, but it turned out I still had to have a concept. And I do think you keep having to go back to your concept as you're getting stuff and making decisions about it. Personally, I like voices to be very varied, and I want to edit so that I'm editing helpfully, but I'm not editing suppressively, that I want there to be the feeling that you're reading a lot of different, you're sort of being taken to a conversation that's going on. And I think that takes a certain amount of experience as an editor to understand how you can edit to showcase the work, and I can't remember how much I edited anyone individually, but MJ has this fantastic piece in which there's a high-speed bus commute, and one message during that, her whole world is completely changed. It's very dramatic, and it managed to have a bus in it. From my purposes, so that's a really, it's an odd thing that it helps to have practice. Like if some people here who are in obviously an area that's had this devastating hurricane decided they wanted to make an anthology that might be about the experience, or it might be about the places that are lost, or something else, you could do that, but you really have to think hard about what your parameters are going to be and how you're going to do it before you just plunge in, because it's really a lot of work, and it can, and you can wind up, not being confused about what you're trying to pull off. So.
Thank you, Lynne. Joe, any insights?
One, I want to apologize. I'm twitching at one of the piece I wrote for Lynne as a tagline was because I had a motorcycle accident and I broke my back. And
yeah, he did. Yeah.
I was sitting now.
I knew he had a story to tell because it was a motorcycle accident that changed his life. One of the things about having an anthology about transit and movement was I was trying to get every kind of good experience and bad. Norma Watkins wrote this one about the golden passport you get once you're a certain age and you can travel on all the mass transit in South Florida for free. So there's an enormous amount of movement, and you can sort of see, as opposed to movement becoming painful and difficult.
Yeah.
And I happen to have remembered the first day I saw that motorcycle, I was concerned. So.
Yeah, I think everybody was. Also, there's so many great questions coming in. I just want to send this offer. My email is joe@joeclifford.com. I can't answer these questions as I'm talking. Multitasking is not a skill set I have. But feel free, please, to reach out and write me these questions. Anybody in the chat over here, and I'll do my best to answer them. Again, that's joe@joeclifford.com. I don't want to feel like anybody's being ignored. I just can't type and answer questions.
And actually, I think my website was put up earlier, so you can contact me through that. That's fine. Really, I would say one of the first things is to read some anthologies. If you're just thinking about starting it, and try to get some models in mind that would be, what you're going for, because they're different sizes, lengths, everything else. And if you were doing something and you were doing, I'm just going to go back to the fact of a hurricane and a changed world is a kind of, there is a desire to write about the experience. But you need to then think about who's going to buy it, or perhaps who's going to use it teaching, like that, maybe not buy it, but maybe it would be used in some other way. And that could be done under the wing of the university potentially. If you had a class where everybody was, generating material, and then you put out word for more, and you could do lots of different things. So part of the idea of writing, of making some kind of proposal, is even if you weren't trying to propose it to some press that requires them, it actually forces you to get straight what you're planning to do, and how much work it's going to be, and how you're going to budget it, and so on. You may have access to a way to print things that will make it easier, but it may not be, and you need to research where you could send a proposal.
So we talked about the importance of a proposal and how sometimes publishers will approach you if they know your work. Sometimes you have to approach a publisher, and then it becomes important to have a very strong goal, a very solid concept, and kind of an idea of what you're going to include. I'm wondering whether you should have a list of authors who are going to participate before you do the proposal, or is that something that comes later?
It can vary. So if you've got I have done ones where collaboratively the other editor knew people I didn't know, and I knew people, so we were both pulling in people, and then people suggest other people. There's this question here about the order of stories in an anthology, which is a later editing question, but the variety. So it's you look at the work you've got, and then you're trying to decide if you have sections, or if there's an arc, or because sections also could help say we're going to focus on this and this and this. As it turns out, the birth anthology started with the beginnings of pregnancy and went on to the traumas that occur. I think we said it could go up till after a year, so it actually had a chronology of situations because of the particular kind of event. But I went through what I had gotten and made subtopics for making good time, and had titles for sections. So that some of it is by reading a lot of anthologies. You can go to the library and get some anthologies, and you see different ways they're organized. There are some that are purely alphabetical by author and things like that. Like all kinds of things can be done. So there's not one absolute set of rules at all. But I do think that you have to figure out and start to understand how much time it takes, which is why we were saying if you've edited a journal or been working at a press, you've already gotten experience, so you know the amount of work that goes into it. It's really hard to start from nothing. If there is a place where you can volunteer, writing for an anthology is writing one short piece, to Mr. Novak, and writing a novel is a big commitment. So those are totally different. For an anthology, you're writing one piece of whatever form. There's poetry anthologies, nonfiction anthologies, essay collections, all kinds of things. If you're going to write a novel, you're committing, it depends how fast you write, but considerable time. And if you're writing a short piece that there's an interest in, and the vision has been made clear to you, that's much. Novels go forever. Because the comments are exactly what I was hinting at. But if you get asked by Joe to write something that he has a Johnny Cash anthology, which was after the Bruce Springsteen one, and one of the ways that you designed that, Joe, was that you had to choose a song that would be then you're not writing about Johnny Cash, you're writing from the name of a song. And I know that I thought, no, I don't think I can really do anything for Johnny Cash. And then I thought, the song I really have always hated is A Boy Named Sue. And then I thought, because that's all about gender and screwed up, and I can write a story that's all about gender and screwed up. So I wrote a story called A Boy Named Zoe. So I went from like no to thinking why to thinking yes. And then I had to do all the work to write a story that, would hang together and everything, it was an ambitious story in terms of the amount of time it covered and stuff, and it had a length limit. So those are tricky.
It's one of the best in the anthology. In fact, I think about that section. There's just a section of that story that I'm not going to talk about, given our earlier conversation. But I think about all the time.
You'll have to tell me privately.
If you get a chance to read it, it's a really remarkable story.
Well, it is time for audience questions. So I have a few. The first one is, it seems anthologies are typically collections of pieces that have already been published elsewhere. Are there many anthologies that seek unpublished submissions?
Many do seek unpublished submissions. The ones Joe's talking about, it's unpublished submissions. And some are a mixture. Some will start with some things that have been published to sort of build on. The Birth one had new work and work that had been previously published. Work that's previously published in a magazine, the copyright still belongs to the author, and the author can sell it to the anthology. If you're working with no budget whatsoever, then you probably don't want to use work that's published, because if it was published in a book, you have to get permissions and things like that. So, but if you were having something that was more local and you had people who were happy to be published for the first time, you would not need the same kind of budget for it. And which is also true for literary magazines. There's lots of literary magazines where it's all new, it's all new work, and that's how it's put together. So.
Yeah, you have something like, the Best American Short Stories. I don't think of that as an anthology. That's a collection, but it kind of gets lumped into the big, anytime we're thinking of individual stories in a collection together, I think it falls under this umbrella anthologies. It's not quite that simple. Most of the times it seems like anthologies, at least the ones I've been involved with, lean toward unpublished. And, certainly there have been times where, previous works accepted, but most of the ones I've been involved with have been unpublished, and you kind of put it together from the ground up. That might be just my preference as an editor too.
Yeah. In a certain way, there are textbooks. If you have a textbook that's full of, that's a book about writing short stories and it has a bunch of short stories in it, Janet Burroway's book or something, it's an anthology in that you're getting to see all that material, but it's surrounded by this other stuff. And there does tend to be a much more expense for obtaining the work for some kind of thing like that. But in the case of something that's being done with a local focus and a notion that there's a market, people who are putting it together have to have a balanced idea before they can offer you money about what they can afford to pay and what they can afford to make back and so on. And I have known people who got in very deep. Some of these were people who were doing it for a cause in some way, but didn't have that much experience, and they made the production too expensive. So the book became expensive. Mm-hmm. And then it's harder to sell if it's expensive. So having a smaller form, this is 15 Views of Miami, which is, I'm sorry about my light here, but 15 Views of Miami was a part of a series being done that were sort of serially written stories, very short ones. And there's a Tampa one. And I think 15 Views of Orlando was the start from the press that was doing this, Borough Press. And it's a beautiful little book. And by keeping the pieces very short, you're not asking the authors for the same thing, and you can pay a smaller honorarium to them. A poetry anthology would obviously be like that too. We actually were writing them serially. That is, the first person wrote a first one, and then the next person saw it, and you were supposed to sort of pick up a thread. But they actually reorganized it and had some rewriting later. And I did hear that they didn't revise mine, but they were trying to make it hang together better than it spontaneously did. But there's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you, Lynne. The next question that we have is, how do you get the word out that you're accepting submissions for your anthologies? How would an author know to contact you to submit a story or an essay for a project? I don't know if you want to tackle this one, Joe.
It's I'm thinking about when I was doing the reading series, and I took, Andrea's idea for lip service and took it out here, and I was doing the submissions, and then we were, advertising on, Facebook or any kind of social media, and we had our own website asking for submissions. With the anthologies, I don't think I've been involved in where I had an open submission policy. and it's been so long since I've gone through the submitting short stories. I don't even know if like things like, you know,
Poets and Writers.
Yeah,
If you go to Poets and Writers will have listings on their website. You don't have to, you can subscribe to Poets and Writers and you get much more because it's also a magazine with lots of information from writers about all different parts of the writing world. It's well worth looking at. And your library may also have Poets and Writers, but Poets and Writers on its website has calls for submissions, and you will see ones that are calls for anthologies there. I would be looking with care at what, you know, who is doing this and things like that. And also it really has to resonate for you. So you have something in mind as soon as you see it, that's, yeah, cool. I want to try that.
I was also going to say that Submittable is a good source.
Yes.
It started as a platform to just submit, but then they made it very specific in the way you can do searches, so that if you look for anthologies within the system, you're going to find the calls for submissions. And
also you'll find calls for submissions from literary magazines or various magazines that have a theme in mind, which is very close to being an anthology and without necessarily as many sort of barriers of production. So, and that also, you would go to Submittable and you just can get loads and loads of information about it. I think you have to respond when you see it because, yes, I've already been writing about that, or I really want to write about that. You can't sort of turn yourself into a pretzel trying to write to fit something that isn't really your, you know, interest or sensibility or whatever.
I agree. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Alison Joseph. She curates the Creative Writers Opportunities list.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great website. And if you Google creative writing opportunities and Alison Joseph together, you'll find the page.
Yeah, it's called like crops in some way. But this talks about charity. There's a question about charity anthologies. I'm not sure what trade-offs mean there, but charity anthologies where you're contributing to some organization that wants to have writing and then use that to raise funds for something else makes perfect sense. And again, you could see all kinds of situations where there's a need to draw attention to something and having creative material to do it with. But those tend to be local or very, very focused in an organization. And if you're doing that, the work is still the same, but your call would be a narrower call because you're going for a certain set of things. But it might still be called to publish.
Changing the anthology, we sent some of a portion of the proceeds to the Bob Woodruff Foundation, which is for veterans. I go to Woodruff and Woodward. So if I got it wrong, it's the one for veterans. But it was an organization Springsteen himself was very near and dear to, and so that's part of the reason, part of how we got his permission and approval to do or no contest to do the anthology. But it's also supporting good cause. So that was a kind of a hybrid effort there.
Mm-hmm. Can we finish this talk with some red flags? What are some red flags for the curators and the authors?
As a submitter, I would not want to pay to submit to an anthology. I've seen, and I there's a lot of things with very high submission fees that I've seen where they're trying to finance the thing by the submitters. A very tiny one, like it's $3 or something, or submission fees for lots of magazines, $3. You used to have to mail it. It costs you the $3 for the mailing, right? But if that would definitely be something where financially it's out of proportion. So that would worry me.
I mean, I don't pay. Writers should never pay. It's bad enough you don't get paid. Don't pay anything, and that's just my thing. Like it's hard enough, and the submission fees, all of it. I just think once you go into that territory, it's paying to play is something I'd avoid. You're an artist. You're writing.
I would prefer to submit to places that pay me, and I don't pay for it. But I can see it's how magazines are been trying to fund themselves. But for an anthology, I think it would be really unusual that you were paying to submit. I just don't think you would do that. I think other things is that you can look at who's asking and look at the track record of whoever is asking for submissions, and if they, what else they've done. If it's clear who the publisher is going to be. Chris and I did the one that Iowa published, knowing we were going to go for Iowa, but we had other university presses or other presses we had in mind, but we had to get the content, a certain amount of content in order to do the book proposal and get them to close the deal. And then we could complete it after that. So we had to have people that trusted us, that we were, knew what we were doing. And we both had background in having done other editing and stuff. So if you have somebody who just makes up a crazy idea and they have no experience whatsoever, they might do great, but you just need to pay attention and understand as much as you can about it.
As I said earlier, anybody can write me. And if you want to write me, ask if it's a reputable press, and please do that, because there's nothing worse, and I can certainly tell you to avoid it. And there's a number of them to avoid.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. It's me, your timekeeper, Jenna Blunt. I'm the CEO of Mighty Blaze, and I'm popping on to say we have all so loved this discussion. And as you can see from the vibrancy of the chat, people have been so helped by everything you've had to say. It has been a total joy. Now I'm afraid I must gong you off, because we have to go to the next classroom for actually my panel on writing community. And thank you for being such an excellent demonstration of writing community today, and how anthologies actually can create community among writers and subsets of writers. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for being at Sanibel this year.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.